Why are you here? Are you here for the swords? Well, if you came for the swords, you are in the right place. The Samurai Sword Museum in Moka, Japan is the right place for swords. Located on the border of Tochigi and Ibaraki prefecture, it's a small, unassuming museum. A blue sign, a small parking lot, but inside an impressive collection. With an entrance fee of just 1,000 yen, you can come in and take a look at the collection. About once a month, they have a day where you can handle the swords. They announce it on their Facebook and their Twitter, which I will link down below. You have to check for dates, it's not always the same. The only complaint I have about the museum is things are not really in any type of order. So I'm going to kind of give it a little bit of an order as I talk about it. The most famous and well-known of the Japanese swords is the katana. However, it is a pretty late evolution, and first we have to talk about some other swords and history to get to it. Jokoto are ancient swords. In Japan, those are swords that were made before 900 AD. There's not really any examples here. These first swords were not what you think about when you think of a Japanese sword. We expect a curved, single-edged sword. However, the first Japanese swords were straight. The Tsurugi was the first Japanese sword that we know of. It was a cast bronze sword from the Yayoi period, and then was made in iron during the Kofun and Heian period. This was the type of sword that you see carried by Yamato Takaru and Fudo in depictions of him. So this was a double-edged sword. Next came the Jokoto, a straight single-edged sword. While the Tsurugi was cast, the Jokoto was forged like Japanese swords that we think about. This was first seen in the Kofun period, and we think it was mostly used on foot, that this would have been a foot soldier's weapon. It's single-edged. We're seeing forging, so this is the beginning of something that we can recognize. Now, in the Heian period, this is where we started to see swords become curved. We think this might have been due to horses being used more in warfare, and influence from the Emishi people and their blades. The Emishi people themselves having a reputation of being mounted cavalry warriors. In the Heian period, the straight swords died out, and this new sword evolved called the Tachi. We're not at the katana yet. The Tachi is curved, single-edged sword, and we look at it, most people would recognize, okay, that's a Japanese sword. In fact, sometimes they are mislabeled as being katana. However, the Tachi was longer, with the intent of it being a cavalry weapon. And at the Tachi, this is where the museum starts to have more examples. So the Tachi itself was worn blade down, and it hung from the waist. This meant that the name of the smith would be on the right side of the blades. It was set up in Japan that the way you carried the sword, even though the smith's name was on the tang and you couldn't see it, that the smith's name was pointed out, away from the body. Mostly intended as cavalry sword, the Tachi blade in turn was improved from studying damaged swords, destroyed swords from battles with the Mongolians. And this is where we start to get some of the different heat treatments. One of the problems that the Tachi had was that it was too hard, where the katana itself and later Tachi after the Mongolian invasions had both hard and soft metal. So the edge is hard, so it can be sharp. The spine, the back part that is not sharp, is softer, so that way it can absorb the blow better. Where a weapon that is just hard can be very sharp, but it can lead to it being brittle. The katana itself developed as samurai started to carry longer weapons and fight more on foot. So it started out as a shorter weapon than the Tachi that could be drawn faster and used as a secondary weapon. The katana was not invented or created initially with the idea of it being your primary weapon. You were probably armed, with a bow, spear, all these other weapons, and then the katana was your last weapon if you were a foot soldier. You've lost everything else. Things are getting desperate. Or it was also a weapon that maybe you could carry outside of the battlefield. It was bigger than a dagger or other type of knives that were used, but, still easy to carry. So the first katanas appeared during the northern and southern court period, when there was conflict between the shogunate and the emperors of the southern court. The oldest known katana is at Kasuga Shrine. So during the Sengoku period, the katana flourished as large-scale fighting broke out, and also non-samurai warriors who were from the farmer class became common. These farmer soldiers used lended weapons like katanas, spears, and guns, and as the period went on, the spear and the gun became much more important as they started fighting in closer formation, so even the katana became less important for them. Now, near the close of the Sengoku period, we also saw multiple sword hunts as competing rulers tried to pacify the nation, or the parts of the nation they controlled, and secure their position. The Edo period saw an increase in trade and less warfare. This meant that regional differences in the sword schools faded, and also because they weren't being used for fighting as much, the katana became more decorative. It received more focus as the weapon of the samurai, moving maybe the focus of training and what people knew away from battlefield weapons to what were more personal defense weapons. Maybe this was a purposeful act by the Tokugawa government to make the samurai of other clans less dangerous? I don't know. There was also an increase in policing and class-based restrictions on weapons ownership. This always happened when a new power came into Japan, a new shogunate. They wanted to take away arms from people that might rebel and make sure that the people that were part of their clique, part of their political movement, were armed. I mean, it's no different than anywhere else. It's just swords instead of guns or whatever it is elsewhere. Guns were also highly regulated under the Tokugawa government, too. These class-based restrictions and also rules about where you could carry weapons and centralized policing led to an increase in less than lethal weapons. So here we are, the Edo period, the artistic side of the katana flourished with more elaborate fittings, and near the end of the Tokugawa era, katanas got shorter and straighter as they started to be used more in close corners and inside buildings in fights between supporters of the shogunate and supporters of the emperor. So this was more of a thrusting weapon. It was a little shorter because people were fighting in alleyways, on streets, in buildings, so it started to be used more for violence again. However, the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, the Meiji era starts, and laws on weapons get stricter again. Once again, they want to make sure that potential dissidents and people that could oppose the new Meiji central government did not have weapons and were limited in the arms that they could have. So at this point, swords were pretty much restricted to the carrying of swords was restricted to the police and the military. And at this point, military swords and police swords took on more of a Western style of fitting and designs. They started to look more like the sabers that you would see in Europe. And then the 1930s came with renewed nationalism and also fighting in China. There was an interest in creating more of a traditional style sword, and so they went back to a katana design for both officers and non-commissioned officer swords. Some of these were family blades refitted with the new fittings, but most were new machined blades. The museum had some of these swords, or maybe just their fittings. These machine blades are popular collector's items outside of Japan, but are actually illegal inside Japan. Basically, in summary, due to the way that the laws are written in Japan, swords are legal, but there's an exception for registered, traditionally manufactured blades. Any new blades, they need to be produced by a certified smith, and they're limited in how many they can make. To get certified, you have to do a 5-year unpaid apprenticeship, and then once a year they have a test that lasts for 8 days that you have to pass. And even after you've done all that, now there's the expense of starting up your own shop. So it's really hard for people to make a living as a sword maker. And of course, along with sword making, there's the scabbard makers, the polishers, the handle wrappers. All of those are needed to create this finished product. And those industries are dying. I think at this point there's under 150 certified smiths left in Japan, and there's less every year. Most of them are quite old, And to be completely honest, if you read much into it, it seems like an industry that's waiting for a recession to kill it. The museum itself, though, is interesting. It has a large collection of swords, a huge range of time periods. They have some non-Japanese swords. They have some other, particularly Sengoku period weapons, and end of the Tokugawa, early Meiji period weapons that were used. Personally, I liked going and getting to pick up the swords. They do have one staff member who speaks pretty good English. It's not a museum that's well known, but it's certainly worth the visit. I hope that you've enjoyed this little tour of the Moka Samurai Sword Museum. If you've made it this far, please give me a like. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Go down to the comment section. Tell me some of your favorite swords or antiques that you saw in this video. And I